Perhaps she surprises you, this bird who suddenly appears just as we are about to start the sermon. I myself was quite surprised at the sight of her last Tuesday when I was making the rounds and watering plants. I often begin with the plants that are right outside my bedroom door, and as I was lifting my watering can, I was suddenly eye to eye with this mourning dove who was sitting resolute on her eggs. Both of us were startled and caught in a moment of fear, which happens sometimes when we encounter the unexpected. Living as we are in a world in which the unexpected is now the expected, I am inviting us this morning into a conversation about fear. Fear as our friend and fear as our foe. We are taught that fear is something to be avoided at all costs. And yet we know that fear is actually a primal natural impulse designed to keep us from putting our hands on potentially aggressive, defensive mother animals that we might not expect to encounter, for example. This protective fear can be intuitive and knowing. Gavin DeBecker works with victims of violence, and many of them, under questioning after the fact, reveal that some part of them knew that the violence was going to happen before they actually acted to protect themselves. There's an instinctive fear that we have. It can make us cautious, and that kind of caution can save our life, especially in these times in which we are facing it in all kinds of unusual challenges. This fear can actually make us behave in ways that might be life and health preserving. I want to be clear, especially this morning, that for some among us today, that instinctual fear is real. This week, using the sleight of hand tactics that lost us the Voting Rights Act, the man who holds the title of president took away the hard-won health care rights of transgender people as just the latest action of rights removed. The fear that people who have seen their rights removed have is based on a threat of survival. It's like the fear-based anger that has filled our streets in an unprecedented, now global uprising. This is the fear of self-preservation, and it is worth noting. And yet, at the same time, fear can keep us from being good listeners. It can keep us from embracing new realities, from exploring and being curious and listening to points of view that we really need to hear. Because there are many new opportunities in this new emergent world that we still can't quite understand. And if we are not careful, we will simply have the kind of fear that is the Chicken Little, the sky is falling kind of fear that might not serve us well. In this new pandemic world, we are asking questions all the time. Where do we find it safe to be together, for example? And how do we use and explore new ways of being together safely, even if it isn't exactly what our heart wants? I have found that one of my new roles as minister that I'm not really loving is that my first encounter with people that I'm really glad to see after a number of months is, please stand 6 feet away. And that's not always what feels good to the heart. An internet search will tell you that our top fears as a society include fears of open spaces, of heights, of flying, well, that continues now anew, of enclosed spaces, of insects, and one on my own list of fears, fear of snakes. This listicle, as blogger Maria Popovich calls our tendency to reduce complex issues to a list we can discover on the internet, was compiled, I suspect, months before our pandemic nation state emerged. If we were to compile a new list today, I suspect it would include things like fear of getting the COVID, fear of keeping food on the table, fear of isolation, fear of contact, and a whole new range of now very complicated fears for the safety of ourselves and of others, especially the Black, brown, and trans people who have already had to face what it means to live in a world where you can't necessarily count on anyone coming to help you when you need help in a way that won't cause more harm. Fears are, as Mark Chase said, with us all, especially in these days. When we are able to process them and understand them and be present to them, they actually create a new kind of intelligence, which can be a guide for us in this time and can lead us actually feeling more peaceful, more powerful, and more present. All things that are helpful in times of unknowing and uncharted waters. And what times could be more uncharted than these? Where, as we talked about in Thursday night's first session of our ethics class, a simple trip to the grocery store becomes a cause for soul searching. Will I endanger myself, the workers in the store, my family who I plan to see later, my coworkers? When the choices to attend gatherings where precautions are being taken, such as the ones on our campus, become a weighing of fears, is my growing isolation a greater danger than my possibility of being exposed? Am I feeling too desperate? Where our fears for survival from a global pandemic or a hate-filled presidency are coupled with other awarenesses, such as the fact that we're looking at possibly the hottest summer on record, and even littler fears like how long it took us to learn not to use plastic bags, which we're now all using again. Now, we may want to push away our fears, and we all need times when we can do that. But in fact, it is also important that we find places where we can be both peaceful and contemplative about what it is we actually are afraid of. Everyone, from spiritual teachers to psychologists to activists, will tell you that avoiding what you are afraid of over the long term does not make things better, and in fact, almost always will eventually make it more likely that you will be in the company of the thing that you fear. You will be in the company of fear, the foe, rather than fear, the friend. Befriending your fear, those who study such things agree, allows fear to be what it is at its best, part of our early warning system that lets us make choices to preserve our own well-being and the well-being of others, rather than being a blanket which smothers our consciousness and makes us more vulnerable to real danger. Dee Becker's conversation and research revealed that just as some fear can save lives through intuition, other fears can cost them. He found that fears of breaking social taboos cause more people to die, because one of the ways this happens is through our social conditioning to be polite, for example, so that a woman who is talking to someone that they begin to believe it does not wish them well or might actually do them harm is more likely to keep talking to them politely out of their fear of doing something rude, for example, slamming the door or running away. I've had to grapple with this often myself. My value of nonviolence is unmovable, and yet sometimes I have to fight against my training as a woman of Asian descent, especially, not to make waves, not to stand out, not to break social norms. And in my case, this is complicated. It's doubled by my being a perpetual outsider, born multiracial before Loving versus Virginia made my existence legal when I was 5 years old, but still not tolerated by many people throughout my childhood. In the last few days, I've been thinking about this, not just because it was the anniversary of Loving Day as it is called, but also because I have been thinking a lot about that fear of violating social niceties. I had to think about that when I got a call on Thursday from the Black leaders in our county asking me to speak at a protest in Danville against our own sheriff tomorrow. While no violence such as that Mark recounted in other counties is okay, and I appreciate the ability of this community to hold multiple truths, I know that this car caravan is happening to protest while facing the COVID reality. And it's happening because we've done all the polite things, all the nice things, over more than a decade in this county. I have personally sat through endless county commission meetings. I have engaged in more peaceful protest outside of the various sheriff's doors than I can count. I even served for 18 months listening to the testimony about racial bias and harm happening within our own county as part of the Racial Justice Task Force, only to see its recommendation for independent oversight of our sheriff's operations scrapped because we were told we should trust the sheriff to monitor himself. I walked last weekend, as I said last week, with the young protesters, and I heard young white males shouting obscenities at law enforcement while the female organizer of color tried to get them back on track. I have been on the streets throughout this pandemic using physical distancing and many prototypes of masks to deliver the food that you made possible through your generosity, and the water too. I watched as officials on cameras said one thing about what we were doing with the unhoused, and as I saw the reality of what law enforcement was doing in the streets, on the other hand, including traumatizing a man with mental health conditions who was still inconsolable on the side of the road, not even with a shirt to his name when I found him hours later. I have prayed my fears through long and sleepless nights, and will probably do so again tonight. And I have made a decision to act from my friend fear, which says that our system is broken and this is our time to say that we want it fixed and to move alongside of those who have lost life and mental wellness again and again in our current system. Fear will be our friend if it allows us to take a pause before doing something that might be second nature just a few months ago, such as walking shoulder to shoulder with a friend, or handing someone your phone to show them something, or a menu, or sharing food. Fear will be our foe if our fears take up more and more and more of our space, leaving no time for living or life. False or overblown fears are another escape from facing just our simple, direct experience. Pema Chodron says that often we try to escape our fears through avoiding them, through distractions, through material things or addictions, through avoidance of reality or retreat behind oversimplistic ideals. And if there was ever a time that challenges oversimplicity in our ideals, this is it. Direct dialogue with our fears, this Buddhist teacher says, is the path most likely to allow us to move towards a true inner peace and fearlessness. The most reliable path from fear to fearlessness, Pema Chodron reminds us, is the gate of awareness. We get here by being open to our emotions, to our thoughts, to our feelings, and to people, even those who are not the same or who do not think or believe the same as we do. That is the holy place to which our hearts can journey if we are able to list our fears honestly and sort them out the way that Mark did in our call to worship. We need to know what fear is and to take the time to listen, to understand it, and to know if it is friend or foe. We have many fears before us now. Fear for our democracy, fear for our families in a time of great unrest and uncertainty, fear about whether we can truly listen to one another from different vantage points and learn to hold our stories together, as our responsive reading said. Last Sunday night, Liam and I were at church preparing to host our interfaith gathering to honor the sacredness of Black lives after what had been a fear-filled and exhausting week. And Doug Tamo was here too, doing yet another of his missions of repair mercy, when a small grass fire broke out across the street behind B'nai Shalom. And after weeks of witnessing outrage over racially based violence, sleepless nights worrying about people's positions and economic security, and months of pandemic, years of continued assault on the basic values of our nation, this seemed like too much. I stood in the parking lot as a small herd of deer ran across Eckley Lane through their instinctual fear. And the turkeys, not always the brightest of animals, can we say, they too knew what to do, they flew up into the trees. And I stood there, frozen with fear at my thought that the buildings that are so beloved, that people haven't seen for so many months, could be threatened, that the vehicle on our property that was someone's home could burn. And then Fear, my friend, stepped in front of Fear, my foe, put a gentle hand on my shoulder, and I got in my car and stopped to lock the gate and to drive down the hill. The next morning was the one in which I was startled by the equally startled eyes of the mourning dove. We exchanged a glance or two each day now, and I've been surprised by the joy that her presence has brought me again and again. Sometimes she just looks tired and worn out, sitting on those eggs, hour after hour. But I find a quiet comfort that new life is being created that close to me. The kind of shelter that Sandy and Pat sang about in our special music today. When we look at our fears, we might be surprised by the joy that is waiting just past the fear, just past the grieving and mourning. It is important to think about that. I know that when you're a preacher, everything can be a sermon illustration, but I think it's metaphorically correct that it was a mourning dove that found me that day, because if we push through our anguish and our fears, I believe we will emerge to find a place of quieter joy, and I believe it is not too far away. I think of the post of a Black colleague who has worked for years against police violence in Minneapolis, listening and writing about the tears that are running down her face as she heard that they would begin to experiment with alternatives to traditional policing. We will not learn how to be fearless until we are comfortable with fear as our friend, as all the traditions tell us. If we get to know our fear, if we embrace it near our heart, as Miranda asked us to do, rather than push it away, we can understand that our faux fear will keep us from what we need to do to survive, and our friend fear will guide us towards those actions that we need to thrive. We can listen more to that friend who tells us when we need to be more careful and also when we need to be more bold. We can open our hearts to new possibilities before us and let fear help us decide how to live best in these times when so much is at stake, how to reach beyond the mourning and the lamentation, to work together for that place where we will find, I believe, our peace, our power, and our joy.